Okay, welcome back to another author interview at Crystal Lake. And today our guest is author Andrew Najberg, who's going to be chatting about his book, In Those Fading Stars, which is a sci-fi horror story collection. So I'm going to let him introduce himself now. So take it away.
Well, hey there, everybody. My name is Andrew Najberg, and aside from my forthcoming release, I'm the author of The Mobius Door and Gala Talk, as well as the young adult fantasy book, The Neverborn Thief. In Those Fading Stars is due out tomorrow, which I'm super excited about, and it's a collection of short fiction that I like to say sort of inhabits the intersection between science fiction, horror, and magical realism. Always looking at the place where humanity rests at that intersection. And it's compiled largely from stories I've been publishing for the last about 3 years. Yeah, I'm really excited to have it out.
So tomorrow is actually October 18th, which will be when this video airs because we're recording early. So, but no worries there. So just give everyone a quick overview of your book.
Okay, so I guess the easiest way is to talk a little bit about how it's structured. So the first and last stories to me are kind of the linchpins of the collection. The first story, Before You Fade Away, I'll admit is actually my well, I don't know if I'd call it my personal favorite that I've written, but I actually think it's the best story that I've written. It's one of those really rare stories that kind of came out almost completely formed in its initial draft. I was dealing with some very complex family issues at the time, and the story kind of is a reflection of it. And so I literally sat down one night after a particularly stressful day, and I had the idea sort of rattling around in my mind already from the last day or two. And I sat down composing at line one and wrote the story pretty much almost in its final form all the way through the end, in one continuous stream. There was one minor edit that I went back through to complete, making a couple of clarifications, but otherwise it really focuses on exploring the difficulty of a parent protecting their child in a often menacing and you know very difficult world. And then the last story is the first. It's actually the oldest story in the collection, and I should mention that the first story is the last story I wrote for the collection. The last story is called A Scenic Place, and I wrote it back in somewhere around March 2021. And it was right after I'd had my first short fiction publication, a fun little story I'd written when I was way younger called The Loneliest Missile. And I was really excited to finally have a piece of fiction out. Up until that point, I'd had a good bit of luck publishing poetry, and but no fiction yet. And so I was really excited to have it out, and I wrote this whole explosion of short fiction following that initial publication. And one of the first ones that came out was A Scenic Place. And it's a story that's largely about an old man, a bench, and a lamppost. And it's set on the backdrop of a nuclear apocalypse. But one of the things that the story focused on was that everything in the story was treated as if it was alive. The bench has thoughts and it has a will. The lamppost does too. But they're also constrained by their identities as these inanimate objects. And the old man, who is the one character who normally would be able to speak, is almost entirely silent throughout it. Instead, it's almost written like a silent film. And one of the things I've wanted to accomplish in this collection is to make unusual and strange aspects of the world come alive, and then also allow us to watch these human characters operate within these really odd, sometimes bizarre and wacky, other times harrowing backdrops.
What were the inspirations for behind writing this book?
So there's a lot of different inspirations. I always like to say that my writing is from my life, but one step to the left. And so a lot of these stories do draw directly from personal experiences and challenges I've faced, except then they're filtered and diffused into a lot of these more exotic scenarios. So, just for example, one of the more traditional horror stories in the collection is called Quick Rental, and it's about a protagonist who finds themselves exiting a very toxic relationship, and they've obtained a new rental on short notice. And as they live there, the place starts to feel increasingly haunted, but then simultaneously they find that their ex's increasingly invasive presence is starting to become a real challenge. That, like, at one point they're washing the dishes and then they look up and their ex is on the other side of the glass. That was, just for example, that was something that was very literally drawn from my own experience. I had moved into a house, the only difference being that that house had, I was living with 5 friends, but I had moved into a house with 5 friends on short notice after vacating a highly toxic relationship. And I was progressively stalked by that ex. And at one point, I was washing the dishes and I looked up and suddenly there she was on the other side of the glass. She had entered the backyard without, fenced in backyard, without any sort of permission or anything like that. And she had become increasingly invasive in my life. And then simultaneously in the story, the house also is becoming increasingly, showing increasing signs of a haunting. And so you end up with the externalization of the stalking through this woman character who is stalking the protagonist, but then also you have a more figurative element of this progressive haunting becoming increasingly invasive in their what's supposed to be their safe space. And so a lot of these pieces draw from difficult places like that. Similarly, one of my favorite pieces from it that people have responded really well to is called The Shut-In Conduit. And two things about that draw directly from me is, first off, the character works in information technology. And before I went into English as a field, I'd actually been an IT worker doing network installations at a local hospital chain. And the character's sort of professional expertise and experience is directly drawn from things that I encountered in the day-to-day workaday life. He was a lot like the people I knew, actually, in the job. And then the character also is a bit of a, as the title suggests, he's a shut-in. He's very apprehensive about the outside world. And similar to the inspiration for that last story, when I had gone through that really negative situation, following it, I did actually pretty much withdraw from sort of social life for a good 6 months. I had, at that point, I'd changed professions entirely, and I was an assistant manager at a coffee shop, and I would literally go to work and then I'd come home and I would not leave the apartment again, until it was time to go to work if I could avoid it. And so I became really reclusive for a while. And so this character's reclusive nature drew directly from what it felt like during that period, where there was this sort of hostile outside, full of anxiety and apprehension that I didn't want to interact with, and I kind of needed to recover from. And so all throughout, my experiences as a parent show up in various different pieces. I have a sister, and we've had a really good relationship for most of our lives. But there are a lot of brother sister relationships in my stories. A lot of my anxieties about either being a parent or a child to my parents show up in these stories as main emotional cores. But then from there, I'm not a big fan of reading or writing literary realism. I do think it's an absolutely beautiful genre. I think it's there's some magnificent work in it, but it's just it doesn't connect to me, and it doesn't really inspire me to want to create. And so, if I want to try to navigate some of these experiences through writing, I have to find a format that I'm going to connect with, and that's where this sort of twist of the story into these more fantastical and exotic environments comes to play.
Okay, so you are mixing up genres a little in this collection with sci-fi and horror and magic and whatnot. So, what can readers expect? I know the one that kind of intrigues me the most, that I saw in the description, was the robot séance story.
Yeah, that one's really fun. That's a lot of the stories do take darker turns. There are threads of abuse and stalking and things like that that do run through it, but there are also some that I do think have a little bit of whimsy to them. And the three robots attempting to hold a séance in the ruins of humanity in order to better understand the nature of dreams is it's still one of my favorite premises that I've come up with, and it was really fun to explore the point of view of what human day-to-day life, what our houses would look like, what our rituals with each other would look like from this really removed perspective. There was sort of a when I was in college, I took a course in anthropology. And one of the first assignments we were asked to do is we were asked to take any sport and try to explain it to an alien species. And it's still one of the most fun assignments I've ever done. It was, sort of thinking, how do we actually make sense of this really, really weird thing we do where we assemble groups of people onto fields and ice rinks and that kind of thing with all these strange implements and balls competing for this totally arbitrary reward. And it was such a blast that it kind of affected a lot of my thinking overall, which is I love trying to take something really ordinary and find a radically different point of view on it. And so, yeah, with Do You Read? That was a huge focus of that one. You see something similar in The Cornflake Ordinary. That's a story about actually it's a gender ambiguous protagonist whose possessions all come to life and are predatory. So the protagonist comes home one day to discover that their cat has been eaten by their reading lamp, and then they become increasingly held hostage by their other possessions as well. And the idea is, how do you take some of the most ordinary, simple objects and then not just make them kind of scary, because it's really easy to sort of animate something, but then also make them make them feel something somewhat meaningful, like they actually comment on our emotional experiences. There's another one called Meeting Quinto, which in many ways it's about a parent trying to navigate her daughter's entry into puberty and approaching adulthood, and sort of her becoming autonomous. But it's in the context of her little girl meeting this fellow named Quinto, who's another seemingly young person, but who also just happens to come from a neighboring dimension. And Quinto is gradually teaching the daughter to hop to different dimensions, to slowly transpose herself into a silicon-based life form, and all of these other things that the mother just absolutely doesn't want, but also doesn't quite understand. And to me, it definitely does comment on a lot of fears and anxieties that I've had about thinking about my kids getting older, about having to watch them begin their own lives more independent of the household, but done in a way that I think has a little more humor to it. It's trying to be a little bit more playful about some of the serious things that we might want to ask. So, there's really definitely two sides to the collection. There are these more whimsical pieces. Another one called which one is Where We Leave Ourselves, which is a story set in a world where humans molt like cicadas as they get older, and so they leave like husks of themselves behind in random places, and their families have to watch over them while they're molting. They have babies' first molting parties, and there's a lot of it that conceptually does come across, I think, as fairly silly, but I think also when you start thinking about what does this say about the way we depend on our families to look out for our well-being, we can pretty quickly move into a little firmer territory. And I think that's the other side of it that I would emphasize is there are these fantastical premises. There's a lot of science, a lot of magical elements, a lot of really supernatural, horrifying elements. But I think every story, or at least I hope every story, connects to something really fundamental and human, looking at questions that almost anybody can relate to.
Okay, so what's your process for creating your characters? Do they come to you as a name, an idea, or do they start talking to you right off the bat?
So that one varies a lot, depending on, first off, where the story is coming from. For example, the piece Before You Fade Away, that was written very clearly in relation to a significant emotional event in my life. That one really was driven very much by an emotional voice. I gave the character a desire that I wanted them to want above all else to protect their childs, and all of their actions follow out of that. And so I essentially gave them an emotional rule that they had to follow. Then in a piece like Do You Read, The Three Robots Holding a Seance, that one was I first had the main character who was the original robot, and I knew right away that his goal or its goal was going to be to try to conduct a séance in order to hopefully discover how people, in his terms or its terms, uploaded themselves into the dreams server. It was trying to figure out this sort of ultimate cloud-based technology, thinking that what it understood of dreams was that it was some sort of cloud technology that we just logged into every night while we slept. Because how do you perfect storage, to me, would be a question that'd be really salient to a robot. But then from there, I wanted other characters to serve as exploratory foils in that one. And so I had this main character that had a really clear drive, but then I set up the other two, one of which is essentially an older robot who really is a little more familiar with the way the world used to be. And then a younger robot who really is sort of, much more excited to be exploring something that's completely new and novel to it. And I tried to use those three as sort of a triangle of foils to bounce off of each other to represent different ways that these robots might look at the same dilemma. Other times, there was a piece like Honeymoon, the third story in the collection, about two newlyweds who don't think they're going to be able to afford a honeymoon until they stumble into a budget space travel agency. And they get so caught up in the excitement of potentially being able to actually celebrate their marriage that they don't really weigh out the risks. And one thing that was really difficult for me and my wife was back when we got married. We actually it was back in oh gosh, it'd be about 2011 now. It was back before housing costs went absolutely berserk, and we had just received a wedding gift of $10,000, and or an engagement gift, I should say. And we were trying to decide how best to plan our wedding. And, weddings are insanely expensive. And, we were looking at it, we're like, even with this money, we don't even have enough to really do like the type of wedding that people seem to do. So what if we don't do a wedding at all and we just put a down payment on a house instead? And that was actually the route we went. And, retrospectively, we're actually like super glad we did that, because, that was like our one best opportunity to do it. And then not too long after, prices started cranking through the roof. And I don't know if if we hadn't done it then, I don't know if we would have done it. But at the same time, there was this sort of element of, okay, so, do we want to focus on this sort of the ideal romance of it, or do we want to like focus on the practicality of it? We had this chance to really start setting the foundation for a family. And so in the story, though, I did kind of take a little bit of our beginning and then say, well, what if we went the other way with this one? And so I explored characters who are not entirely unlike my wife and myself, and I explored these characters and what might have happened if we had gone the more reckless route and just kind of frittered away the money on ceremony and enjoyment, and then instead of trying to do something a little more concrete. So yeah. That's where a lot of it does come from. And then sometimes the characters, especially side characters for me, do largely just start talking to me off the page. So when I was writing a piece like Meeting Quinto, where you have this character from another dimension who's trying to sort of, teach the daughter of the main character to be one of the cool kids. Really, there was a certain element where once I knew where the character came from, once I'd already designed that plot element that brought them into the narrative, their interactions really wrote themselves. So it kind of varies. And then every once in a while, sometimes characters, I put them on the page, and then one line at a time, I just sort of ask, okay, so what's this person do next? And I just kind of sit there and stare at the page until I'm like, oh, I know what they do next. And I do just sometimes arbitrarily type it down. And so that's so you don't see that as often, and a lot of them are more deliberate. But sometimes, especially when you feel like you're really in the rhythm of a piece that has a lot of atmosphere and a lot of mood to it, you end up writing the characters not always as individual characters themselves, but as extensions of the experience of a protagonist. And at that point, the mood and the movement of the mood within the piece becomes every bit as important as the character themselves. I think the piece that would best be seen in is the fourth story in the collection, Robot Fish Don't Know They're in Water, about a young adult who was moved to Mars against his will by his father after the passing of their mother. And that one was really characterized by the main character's kind of bleak outlook. And, the environment that I created for that story is also kind of bleak and a little bit somber. And so I wanted the characters to either fit that mood directly or to serve as a very specific contrast against it. And so everything they said and did had to have a connection to that, to the point where I would actually adjust their characterization to make sure that their character would logically speak and react that way.
Okay, so what is it about the sci-fi genre and the horror genre that appeal to you?
I'll actually tackle those questions separately. So for science fiction, honestly, I love science. I think the universe is just absolutely wacky and wild and bizarre and fascinating. And so, like the other day, I was reading about this observational experiment where these astronomers observed the same event three times at different times. And what I mean by that is literally the same event was able to be experienced sequentially three times because of the way space time bent the incoming light to our planet. Some of it that went along one path reached us earlier, but then they were able to watch the same event unfold through light that took another path and reached us later. And then finally, a third set of light, or however you want to describe it, arrived after that. So they literally watched the same event, the same temporality happen three times. And, you read a story like that, and, it just reminds you of how phenomenally magical the universe actually is. And then, of course, there's the flip side to it as well, where you also look at some of the things that happen on the cosmic scale, and you see just how existentially terrifying the universe is as well. That it is a hostile place. It's inimical to human life in most respects. You write a story set in orbit, and one thing that you really end up thinking about is, oh my gosh, every single thing that can happen can probably kill us. It's absolutely fascinating to me on just a very existential level. And then, so as a result, though, I love reading about science. I watch as much as I can about science, and I try to work a lot of that into the narrative. So I tackle questions like colonizing Mars, non-carbon based life forms, quantum transposition between dimensions. All of that stuff becomes fair game, and because we are making such rapid and amazing progress right now too, it also helps keep the stories feeling unique. I don't think a lot of the elements I'm working with are 100% original to me, especially when you boil it down to their fundamentals. Fathers protecting their children, a mother who's trying to figure out how to tell her daughter that she has terminal cancer. There's a lot of really kind of core human questions that could be in any story just about, but we also have to ask, how do we bring a unique and original voice? And sort of staying up with frontline science definitely is a major way to keep preserving that. For horror, so I think I think a lot of people turn to reading and writing for one of two reasons. One, the most common, is probably escape and entertainment. A lot of people do love to lose themselves in a story, and I think horror has a really unique way, because of the way it plays with the immediacy of fear, of transporting us very viscerally. We can really immerse in a horror sequence in a way that we can't always in a really vivid and well described piece of realism. Take, for example, any horror movie where we know we're being manipulated to expect that upcoming jump scare. You have all of the, you have the visual dynamics change, the mood darkens, the tone grows more tense, the music rises in that way that prepares you for the escalation, but you know it's coming, but you still do get caught up in that tension. In contrast as well, though, I think the other reason people read horror is that I think all of us face substantial difficulties in our lives. I mean, it's not possible to live a long time and not face tragedy and not watch it happen around us. So, our grandparents are going to pass, our parents are going to pass. So, everyone has that friend who died in a car accident or some other unexpected way, or died of a disease, or committed suicide. I mean, there's any number of losses and grievances that we can face. We injure ourselves, we get our hearts broken. I mean, there's so many ways in which the darkness of life is guaranteed to intersect with us. And horror is a way to be able to very unabashedly explore some of the most difficult human experiences. I think that a lot of people find great comfort in horror. They see, they do see that, other people experience the same things, or maybe they'll see what they went through projected out onto the page, and it'll help objectify it for them so they can get a new perspective on it. There's any number of ways in which reading horror can help us navigate some of those difficult experiences, even if it's just to desensitize ourselves to a little bit, just to remind ourselves, hey, death is a thing, and it's okay to feel how powerful it is when it crosses our path. So yeah, there's a lot of different reasons, but and I think that kind of gets to the core for me of both science fiction and horror as well.
Yeah, definitely I think that's why horror and sci-fi work well together too, because horror plays on the fear side of sci-fi with the everything can kill you.
Oh, absolutely. No, I grew up watching a lot of science fiction and horror movies. Actually, one of the first movies I remember watching was the original Alien when I was 4, and so I've always had that connection between. Just the implacable nature of the universe, and science fiction and horror wrapped up all together. And it's interesting too, because you also do contrast it against things like 1950s sci-fi, that golden age of sci-fi where there was such a tremendous optimism and vision for the future. And even then, though, it was always, humanity has overcome or found a way to conquer this universe. It was always through human terms. The universe itself, even in the most hostile science fiction, or the most hopeful science fiction, the universe itself never gets any nicer. That's the one thing I think that's really universal behind almost all science fiction views.
Okay, so what was your favorite scene in the book?
Oh, that's a tough one. So I would probably there's actually two I'll mention really briefly. One is in the story "Something to Believe In." That's a story about a young man who finds he's playing out of the swamp near his house, and he finds a bleeding feather, and he kind of embarks on his own quest to try to understand why this is happening. So he goes to he takes it to a university, and he goes in search of a monastery, but it's been converted to a brewery. And at the end of the story, he finds himself caught between this really absurd battle between a giant deity bird and a god frog. And it's a piece that of course is about it's about the tension between science and religion, and about somebody who's young trying to figure out how they orient themselves towards the universe. But at the same time, it was so fun to write this really oddball confrontation between these two really just absurd and fairly bizarre creatures. And the other is actually at the end of the story, Honeymoon. And this was one where the plot actually, a lot of my stories, I do, think through very carefully. The plot is something I decide, very deliberately. But every once in a while, you do have a story that kind of writes itself or takes over at some points. And so in the story of Honeymoon, this young couple is out on a vacation with a tour guide onto this beautiful world, but that they also kind of discover is a lot more dangerous than they originally expected, or that their guide would have had them believe. And along the way, they find themselves facing paywalls to be able to access the safety features of their suits, because it is this budget lowballing travel agency. And at one point, they're forced to decide whether or not they are going to risk their lives to save their guide, or flee and attempt to return to their travel craft to escape. And the wife doesn't want to leave, or doesn't want to leave their guide behind, but the husband thinks he's saving his wife's life, and so he drags her off, and they get back to the spaceship. And originally I had actually planned that to be part of the end of the story, that they were going to sort of escape, but then their marriage would be over because of the clear difference between the characters that emerged in the decision. But instead, when I reached that scene, I realized that because of the way this travel agency has all of these paywalls and these budget features and things like that, I decided that it would make more sense if they insulated themselves against any sort of theft or loss of their equipment. And so basically, I made it so that they could not take off without their guide. That his biometric signature needed to be inside the spacecraft in order for them to be able to depart. And just at that moment, they discovered that the guy is actually still alive and being consumed by this acidic gaseous cloud creature that they've encountered. And so they're trying to, the husband is trying to convince the guy to give over the override code to allow them to take off, while the guy has been abandoned to be dissolved by these creatures. And it was one of those moments where the tension became really fun and unexpected in a very dark and macabre sort of way. But the whole piece ends up being the somewhat satire of both the measures that late stage capitalism would take to make a profit, but then also the mindset it might force people into. And so, yeah, it was this really unexpected moment where things came together in a really chaotic but fun way.
Okay, so what was the hardest scene that you had to write in the book?
That is definitely the story Don't Look There. Don't Look There is, or it's the darkest piece in the collection, in my opinion, really without a doubt. And it navigates the life of a child who witnessed very directly and imminently the murder-suicide of his parents. And it basically, much of the story is told in two parallel tracks. One is the experience of when his mother comes into his room to tell him they're going to be playing the game Don't Look There, which is the game of not looking at the spot where she had just murdered his father. And this kid is he knows something's wrong, but he also is trying. You get the sense that this is a very difficult house to live in, and so the child is still trying to navigate his mother's wishes. And as he does so for about 3 straight days, until he wakes up one morning and his mother has killed herself by ingesting prescription medications. And then there's the other path of the story, or the other thread of the story, which is the child being placed in foster care and growing steadily older and trying to navigate the traumas of having witnessed all of this. And I do really firmly believe in in treating subjects like this, not for sensationalism. I don't, like some of my pieces are kind of wacky and a little bit out there. This was a story that I took a lot more seriously. I wanted to really explore a legitimate and considered view of childhood trauma, of deep familial loss, and the way that lingers with the character as he grows older. And so I really had to I took a lot more time with this one than I do with nearly any of my other stories, because I wanted to make sure I was absolutely respectful of the subject matter.
Yeah, I can see that. So, what is the hardest part of writing fiction for you? What comes easy to you in the writing process?
So what comes easy is premises and setups. That I'm not going to lie. I have a folder with a dozen outlines of novels. It's got fragmentary starts of 100 different short stories. And I think they're actually, like not to talk myself up, but I think they're good. I think they're really good ideas, and I think that's something that really comes naturally to me. Coming up with premises, bringing together unusual elements is definitely something that's always been at the core of what I do. But then there is the other part, though, which is once you pursue past just that opening burst of inspiration, that opening idea, the premise, or the first character who hits the page, there is that element of really trying to build out a sustained narrative. And I always kind of say that I'm really great at the beginning. I think um, I'm pretty good at complicating those beginnings too, and so I feel pretty natural moving into the middles of my stories. But I'll tell you, writing endings is my absolute least favorite part, without a doubt. And I have gotten a little more comfortable with it once I started deciding that I'm okay with some of my stories being a little more inconclusive at the end. So I do have some open-ended stories where you are supposed to read into it for yourself what it means or where the character has ended up. But even then, yeah, nothing makes me more anxious than approaching that ending action and trying to decide whether or not I've actually successfully ended the story or whether I just stopped writing it.
Okay, so who are some of your favorite authors?
So there's a lot of different folk. I read pretty broadly. And so just for example, probably my all-time favorite author or favorite book that I always come back to is Franz Kafka's The Trial. I'm a huge Kafka fan. I discovered him in college. I've read The Trial like 20, 25 times at this point. It's one I read about every year if I can. And, I think, kind of like our earlier conversation with that implacable nature of the universe, Kafka dealt with some really similar challenges, looking at the
Mhm.
way in which society itself can often feel like this faceless, impersonal void that does not have any care for how we turn out. And he was no, he was no. He didn't shy away from the uncanny. He didn't shy away from ambiguity and leaving things open for interpretation. And I always thought there was a lot of really fascinating risk in his writing that I think is very admirable. And I like to try to bring with me to some of my own stuff. Of course, more recently, I'm definitely a huge fan of Jeff Vandermeer. For folk who've read my novel Galatok, of course, they know that there's definitely some pretty direct influence between Vandermeer's Annihilation and Galatok. Annihilation's another of my contemporary favorite books. Then, like my all-time favorite author is probably Haruki Murakami, the Japanese author who wrote The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, IQ 84, Hard-Boiled Wonderland, At the End of the World, Wild Sheep Chase. I mean, just a huge catalog of books at this point. And one of the things I really enjoyed enjoyed about Murakami is that, you know, in a lot of ways, he's treated as a literary author. He explores things like, you know, what's it like to be, you know, to live in contemporary Japan? How does Japan understand its own history? But he's also not afraid to do that in the context of, you know, magical science elements, of horror elements. He has fantastical and bizarre creatures enter his stories without explanation. Characters that you know, sometimes will turn out to have magical powers that don't, you know, don't have any sort of literary grounding in science or something like that. Instead, you just accept it, and then you have to look at, okay, so what's this stand for, and what's this say? Um, but then, you know, more recently, I mean, I've been really getting into a lot of indie horror authors, and so a lot of my favorites now, you know, are people writing right now. So it'd be like, you know, Andrew Van Way is a personal favorite of mine. Head Like a Hole was sort of my entry into reading indie horror, and I think it's a phenomenal novel. And he's just a fantastic crafts person. Blaine Daigle, the author of The Dark Rue and The Broken Places, is and Dark and Endless Sea. All of his books are exemplary in how effectively they use description and voice to create atmosphere. And there's so much to learn from that for somebody writing horror. You know, it's definitely, these are books that I'm happy to read multiple times in order to better understand how they're functioning so that I can take some of those same elements to my own work. John Cohn, of course, is a favorite of mine as well. You know, Slash Tag and Everything is Temporary are both absolutely fantastic. And you know, I think he brings a great wit and intelligence to his work. There's sort of a satirical, you know, dark eye to everything that I find really compelling. MJ Mars has been a fantastic writer to read and work with. You know, then there's you know, folk like Duncan Ralston and Nick Roberts and John Durgan and Jay Bauer. I mean, I could just keep listing some of these folk off because Megan Stockton is absolutely amazingly talented. Yeah, I mean, I could literally keep listing off just so many voices that are currently emerging in indie horror. I think, you know, in a lot of ways, we're sort of in the golden age of indie horror, and I think it's really exciting. And my shelves are just filling with some of the best writers I've read in a long time.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely a lot of good writers in indie horror. So tell us about some of the other books you've written.
So right now I have three novels out, and then I have one more coming out later this year. My debut novel was The Mobius Door, small town New England cosmic horror. I grew up in New Hampshire, and you know, I grew up reading Stephen King and Dean Koontz, and I really, you know, I really wanted to write a novel that paid homage to the people who got me so excited about horror in the '90s and early 2000s. And so Mobius Door tells the story of a young boy named Stuart who's out playing after school one day and in the woods near his house, and he finds a mysterious freestanding door. And when he opens the door, he inadvertently unleashes upon his small town a deeply malevolent force. And meanwhile, his family comes to discover that the reason the door was in the woods is that it was waiting the arrival from the other side of another deeply malevolent force. And now they're all caught in between. Galatok is claustrophobic island dystopian horror. It's set about 40 years after a limited nuclear exchange leveled much of Europe. It's about a government survey team that is dispatched to an island called that they call Galitok, that is based on the very real island Galiotok. Galiotok is an island that housed a very famous and notorious prison that operated under communist Yugoslavia, particularly the dictator Tito. And of the 16,000 prisoners who were interred onto Galitok, over 4,000 died from starvation, thirst, disease, and exposure. My grandfather was actually sentenced there for smuggling Western goods and capitalist propaganda under the Iron Curtain. He survived his 3-year sentence there, but 25% of the inmates there did not. And so it was a really fascinating location. People still tour the ruins in the island, and my vision of it was that what if this island, this prison resumes, and what kind of activities would then take place there? And so this government survey team, upon arrival, begins discovering that the cover story that they had received of why the prison had been shut down is inaccurate, and that each of them seems to have their own mission or purpose for being there. And then finally, I have The Neverborn Thief came out in March of 24, and it's a middle grade dark fantasy novel. And it's about a young boy named Connor who wakes up in the middle of the night to discover that his shadow is being stolen. And he interrupts the theft partially, but he finds that he has to pursue the thief into a dark, dangerous realm called the Shadowlands. The Shadowlands is an ancient, broken kingdom with its own mythology and folklore, its own cast of mythical creatures developed, solely for this story. And yeah, it's sort of it's my attempt at a sort of a dark, almost horror fantasy adventure. And I've got some pretty interesting news about Neverborn Thief itself that I can't quite share yet, but I'm hoping I'll be able to talk about very, very soon. But there is a book related to it coming out November 26th, which is called Try Not to Die in the Shadowlands. Try Not to Die is a series ran by Mark Tullius, and it's basically a more adult-oriented choose-your-own-adventure story for horror novels. And Try Not to Die in the Shadowlands traces a character who is reeling with the loss of his younger brother who drowned in their swimming pool. And during the funeral, he suddenly finds himself confronted by his younger brother's shadow, who leads him into the Shadowlands, where he experiences his own unique adventure in that particular world. And one thing that's really exciting about it is, unlike a traditional novel, of course, it has the choose your own adventure sort of branching structure, but it also has 8 unique endings where your larger path through the story will lead you to a very specific, tailored outcome to your own decisions. So yeah, that's what I've got out, and or coming out in the very near future.
Okay, well, they all sound fascinating, and that leads us into the next question. What is your next project? Which you sort of answered. But is there anything else that you got coming out soon?
Yeah, I do have actually two other things worth mentioning. May 25, I have a science fiction novel called Extinction Dream, contracted through Wicked House Publishing. Comes out, May 2025. It's about a man named Marcus Cole who is, it's set in a sort of eco-dystopian future. So, climate catastrophe has done considerable damage to Earth. There is quite a lot of geopolitical tension, and this character is serving in the military, and he receives orders to join what's called orbital deployment. To everybody he knows, it's basically a research gig. It's supposed to be, it's kind of mocked actually, because they're not doing any of the real fighting that's going on, in places like the Middle East and the Black Sea on the edge of Russia. So he thinks he's being kind of set out to dry in this really really lame research position. But when he gets there, he finds out that he's now a frontline soldier in a war against an alien force that is invading us telepathically. And Basically, the story follows the course of his squad as they're starting to lose the war and becoming increasingly desperate for a solution. But I'm really excited about that one. It was enormously challenging to write, in that I really wanted to have at least a solid level of scientific legitimacy to it. So I did quite a bit of research leading into it about how one might simulate gravity through moving parts in a space station, the way zero-G physics of motion work, and things like that. It was a lot of fun to work on, but also a bit of a nosebleed at times as well. And I think people will be really pretty blown away by that one. And then right now, I'm actively writing another novel called Eat the Light, which comes out February 26th. February 2026, I should say. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the principal drafting, and it's about an 8 and an 11-year-old girl whose father comes home one day with a shotgun, and he reveals that their house has a secret bunker underneath it, and he locks the two of them inside and then disappears outside. And there may or may not be a cataclysm occurring beyond the walls of the bunker. But the story is largely about how these two little girls are going to try to navigate this extremely difficult world they've suddenly found themselves in.
Okay, well, that sounds like a lot to look forward to. And I think we will wrap the episode up here. And I'd like to thank you for being a guest. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and that's it for this episode, and bye for now.